Sure, like David and Tom, I can say that it's good to be back with you after a few weeks away, and I'm sure that those other two gentlemen up here are feeling just as refreshed as I am, and happy to see so many friendly, familiar faces. Some of you may remember an old TV show from a few decades ago called WKRP in Cincinnati. In case you're one of those who's not seen it, it was a situation comedy show about the staff of a radio station. And one of the main characters was a late-night DJ called Dr. Johnny Fever. And one time he was having a conversation with the beautiful secretary, Jennifer Marlowe. And in the conversation, Jennifer was sharing that she had grown up in a religious family, and in fact had been so steeped in religious faith that she had memorized the entire Bible. Johnny was very skeptical, as you can imagine you would be of somebody making that claim, but she challenged him, saying, "Just name a chapter and a verse." So he said, "Well, okay. How about Genesis chapter 3, verse 7? And in her most seductive voice, she said, "And they were both naked." He just had to pick that verse, didn't he? That's a quote, of course, that comes from the story of Adam and Eve, which we heard a few moments ago, which is part of the broader story of creation, which we find at the beginning of the Bible story. God created everything that there is. And last of all, God created human beings. And of course, God created us naked. Reflection on this story in the tradition of the Christian church has often been, especially in recent times, on its relationship to science. How does the account of this story compare with what the field of scientific knowledge might tell us about the origins of the universe? Or perhaps the story has been compared in some way to the field of history, and to find out what this story might tell us about the past of human civilization. But I would like to suggest that the main point of the story is a theological one. For what it wants to achieve is to tell us that everything that we see has been created by God. God created the land and the trees and the plants and all the animals that exist. And God created the sun and the moon and the stars. And as the cherry on the cake, God created human beings. And you and I are made of the same stuff of the universe. Our bodies are made of hydrogen and oxygen and carbon and other fundamental elements of the universe. And yet there is something more about us, and that is that God has given us soul. The breath of God has been breathed into us that we might have life. Some folks in our world would argue differently. They would say that there is, in fact, only God and no creation. That everything we can see and feel is nothing but the outward expansion of God's self. Yet others would take a different view and say that there is, in fact, no God. There is only the universe. There is what we can see and feel and smell, and there is nothing that we cannot perceive with the senses. Christians and Jews, on the other hand, who take our story of the Bible as the beginning of our worldview believe that there is both God and creation. There is the eternal God, whom we can only understand in the most vague and abstract ways, and there is also the universe. There is creation. There is God and what God has made. And as the beginning of the Bible story tells us, what God has made is good. I don't know how often you reflect on this idea that you have been made by God, that you and me and all of us exist because God has made us in love and God has breathed life into us. Just think about how wonderful that is by comparing the idea of making or creating anything. Many of you will remember our dear friend Bob Hancock, who a few weeks ago left us just a bit too soon. And some of you with me will be celebrating his memory and giving thanks for his life here next Thursday. And those of you who knew Bob will remember his wonderful wood carvings. How he could take a lifeless little block of wood and through the loving care and attention and hours of painstaking labor, he could whittle away at that chunk of wood and make it into a lovely shape. And then he would take his wonderful gifts as a painter, and he would lovingly paint that little creature until that lifeless hunk of wood began to look like a bird that was ready to take flight. Something that was created out of nothing more than an idea or a vision. We might say the same thing about a musician who can take nothing more than the faintest idea and turn it into a beautiful song or even an entire symphony. And of course, the same thing could be said about a poet who takes just an inkling or a notion and can come out of nowhere with a verse that makes us laugh or smile or cry. Or the same thing could be said about an inventor who, out of nothing but a need and an opportunity, comes up with an invention, a product that could even change people's lives. It's amazing to think of the wonder and joy of something that has been created. And friends, you and I, and all human beings now around the earth and before us and those who will come after us have been created by God, and God has breathed life into us. Well, that's the good news. The bad news is that our human lives so often reflect pain and suffering, which were not God's intention for us. We experience things and we see in others those things which do not reflect the intention or the purpose of the glory of God for our existence. Sometimes we experience in our own lives, and even if we're so fortunate not to suffer, to see in those around us, in our community or around our world, things like poverty, violence, corruption, lying, cheating, stealing, so on and so forth. We're only too painfully aware of these realities. Where have they come from? Well, one thing we see in the opening pages of the biblical story is how God has given us as human beings freedom to choose. God has breathed the life into us in such a way that we are able to choose what we want to do and what we want to say and to live with the consequences. And the truth is that of all the things we see of evil and suffering around the world are the cumulative choices when sometimes we choose to do the wrong thing, or we choose to avoid doing the right thing. I know this is certainly true of my own experience. I am often very selfish in my choices, and will choose to do or to say something which I think is at least of a short-term benefit to me, even if there are maybe negative consequences for someone else. I know every night before I go to bed just about, I have a bedtime snack. And I know that I shouldn't do this. I know it's not good for me. And most of the time, I'm not even hungry. And yet, time after time, I do it anyway, even though I know better. And of course, this is a trivial example. I would be embarrassed to tell you of all the times where I have done or said something wrong, done or said something that was hurtful to somebody else. And even though I knew better, I couldn't seem to help myself. And I would do it anyway. There was somebody called Augustine. He lived in the 4th century. He's one of the most famous writers and thinkers in the history of the Christian faith. And he said in his book called Confessions that ever since the time he was a small child, he was almost entirely driven by a desire to fulfill the instantaneous wishes of his self. You know, his mother would want something for him. And deep down, he would know that what his mother wanted for him was the right thing. And yet he would cry and scream to get his own way, even though in the heart of hearts, he knew that wasn't always right. The Apostle Paul says in one of his letters preserved for us in the documents of the New Testament that I know what I am not to do, but I do it anyway. And this is what we find symbolized in the story of Adam and Eve. They knew they were not to eat from the fruit off the tree that was in the middle of the garden because God had said not to. And they knew that. But yet they did it anyway. And of course they rationalized it the same way I would rationalize it. That's not such a big deal. It's just a little fruit, right? Just this one time. And so the enduring power of the story is to symbolize what so many of us would do and the manner in which so many of us would do it. So we've heard the good news and the bad news, but in the end, with the story of God, the triumph is to the good news. Because we find also in the pages of the Bible that God has solved this problem. And God has done so in Jesus. For you see, in the person of Jesus, God has begun the transforming work of renewing our world in such a way that the consequences of our poor choices will disappear. In fact, the transforming work of God is presented as so wondrous and so great that in fact it can be compared only to the act of creation. In fact, the early Christians call it a new creation, by which God is renewing and restoring the goodness throughout the created order, and doing so in the person of Jesus. Incidentally, this is how we can make the best sense of the story of Jesus' life, I would put to you. This is how we can make sense of the things we read in the Gospels. His teachings, his healings, his miracles, his death and resurrection, even his miraculous conception in the womb of the Virgin Mary. Many thinkers, especially in recent times, have looked at the stories of Jesus and seen random and disparate episodes of tradition about Jesus that have maybe been haphazardly pasted together to form a gospel narrative. But I would put to you that all of these seemingly different things things as different from Jesus talking about loving our neighbors, to calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee, to his death and resurrection. All of these things are in fact held together in a beautiful unity around the theme that we are meant to see in him the creative power of the God of the universe, who is effecting work of new creation in the midst of the world. And in fact, among the earliest Christians who reflected on the story of Adam and Eve, we find them not speculating about the scientific origins of the universe, or speculating on perhaps the age of human civilization. No, rather we see, in fact, a point of contrast between the first Adam and his partner Eve, who chose to disobey God, and Jesus, who is called the new Adam, who through his perfect faithfulness began to embody the renewing and transforming work of God. Sometimes I like to watch a program where these very skilled technicians and artists will go around finding old classic cars that are in very rough condition and restoring them. It's really amazing to see what was an old rust bucket. You'd have to almost pay someone to take it out of your backyard. And these wonderful artists can take and restore the vehicle in a few short weeks so that it is something absolutely beautiful, something making your mouth water, and for those of a certain age, bringing back happy memories of a first car or maybe a favorite old movie or something like that. Imagine that if there were mechanics and painters and so on and so forth who could take an old rust bucket and not only turn it into a beautiful, good as new classic car, but not only that, turn it into something which will never again rust or decay or break down. Something which can be driven around and never again be in an accident. Something which could be driven indefinitely and never again pollute the environment. And if you think about that, we begin to get a sense of the way that God is at work transforming the world and transforming you and I. There was a well-known Christian writer in the United States who a few years ago wrote that even though the world seems tragically broken, and we can find ourselves in almost hopeless despair at the possibility of the world's problems ever being solved, there is enough goodness in the world to make it both fixable and worth fixing. And in many ways, that is a beautiful expression of what the good news is. That for God, there is enough goodness in the world, in creation, to make it both fixable and worth fixing. And we see God's desire to do this, and more than that, the beginning of God's work to do this in Jesus. And part of the good news for us is that God is at work not just in the world, in the universe, in a bigger sense, but individually, in you and me, in our hearts and our minds. And that God is busy transforming you and I from the likeness of Adam and Eve, who in their disobedience were separated from God, into the likeness of Jesus, who in his perfect love and faithfulness was in perfect unity with God. And we can have total confidence, in fact, that this is our destination, that this is our end result, because we have certainty about the beginning point. And we've seen such concrete steps toward that goal in the person and in the story of Jesus. And because of this, we can have the wonderful confidence and the hope that one day we will be with God, and that we will, in the fullest sense, reflect the purpose and the glory of God for which we were made. Amen.